For joining us. My name is Pat Weedoff, and I am a board member for Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, the Tucson, Arizona nonprofit organization that is bringing you this third Thursday Food for Thought presentation. For tonight's third Thursday program, Old Pueblo is delighted to introduce our guest presenter, anthropologist Aaron Wright, PhD. Dr. Wright is a preservation anthropologist with Archaeology Southwest, a nonprofit organization based in Tucson, Arizona. He specializes in the cultural landscapes of southern and western Arizona, focusing on the Hohokam and Platian archaeological traditions. Dr. Wright's book-length publications include Leaving Mesa Verde, Peril and Change in the 13th Century Southwest, which he co-edited with Tim Kohler and Mark Varian in 2010. The award-winning Religion on the Rocks, Hohokam Rock Art, Ritual Practice, and Social Transformation, published in 2014. The Great Bend of the Gila, Contemporary Native American Connections to an Ancestral Landscape, co-authored in 2016 with Maren Hopkins. And Sacred Southwestern Landscapes, Archaeologies of Religious Ecology, in 2024. His recent honors include the Arizona Archaeological Society's Professional Archaeologist of the Year Award in 2023 and the American Rock Art Research Association's Castleton Award last year. Dr. Wright has led several archaeological site tours for Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, and in 2023 he taught a rock imagery recording course co-sponsored by Old Pueblo and the Arizona Archaeological Society. This is his fourth presentation for Old Pueblo's third Thursday Food for Thought series since his first one in 2016. His presentation tonight investigates what is appropriate alternative terminology for the rock imagery of the indigenous peoples. It follows up on an article he co-authored recently with archaeologist John Welch, which has been accepted by American Antiquity, the leading professional archaeological journal in the United States. Dr. Wright, welcome back to Old Pueblo's third Thursday Food for Thought series.
Thank you so much, Pat. I want to thank Al for inviting me to give this lecture this evening. I'm going to share my screen. Let's get started. So as Pat mentioned, the presentation tonight is based on an article that we recently published. I published with my co-author, John Welch, a colleague at Archaeology Southwest. And as the presentation will demonstrate, this has been a question that's been brewing, at least in my career, for some time. But before I advance the slide, for anyone that's interested, that awesome petroglyph panel on the cover slide here, that's a late Patillon panel from the lower Gila River. So a backdrop for the presentation tonight, most of us are probably aware that archaeology has maybe a complicated relationship with descendant communities, especially so in the US. It's only been until the last several decades where we really integrated their opinions and their thoughts into our research. Of course, that was brought about, instigated with the passing of NAGRA in 1990, which basically made archaeologists start talking with descendant communities. And through those dialogues, we've learned that quite a few of the terms that we use historically are problematic. They're loaded terms. So some could say that they're racist terms. The concept tonight is rock art. You see I've highlighted there at the bottom. I would say it's one of these problematic terms. You may see these words still, but if you've been following archaeological literature, you've probably noticed that some of these have faded into the past. And it's really because language conditions perceptions of the world. So this is a linguistic anthropological, I guess, theory, but basically how we speak about things forms our understandings of the world that we live in. And, you know, in a more simplistic way, we can just simply accept that words can hurt. And, you know, it's only through dialogue with communities where we learn, you know, why these words are problematic for some people and sometimes. And so our term tonight is this word rock art. And there actually is a rock art glossary or dictionary. It's cited there at the bottom, published, I think there's a recent version, 2010, but you know, as defined, rock art is the non-utilitarian anthropic markings on rock surfaces. So very, very general concept. And as you can see with the examples on the slide here, we're talking about petroglyphs or images that are pecked into the rock, as well as paintings on rock. And then we get hybrid forms such as the bottom image where there's actually a petroglyph that was painted. And I don't have an example to show, but you will also find examples where paintings have been pecked, for example. So this includes pretty much everything created on rock surfaces. Now, there's an alternative definition by David Whitley. David Whitley is a preeminent rock art scholar in North America. He likens it to landscape art, pictures, motifs, and designs placed on natural surfaces. So we can quibble with the definitions. I would say that Whitley's definition would include carvings in trees, for example, arboroglyphs and things like that. But rock imagery, rock art, a lot of folks will lump in ground figures or geoglyphs or intaglios, like I'm showing here in this slide. Of course, these are iconic figurative motifs. These are the world famous Blythe intaglios along the Colorado River. Is this art? It's a theoretical question we can ask ourselves and other people. These images really can't be seen unless you're in the air. So we have to think about the audience as well and trying to interpret what is art, what's not art. These are figurative, so we can recognize these forms, but there are also examples of geoglyphs or ground figures that are not figurative. And actually, the vast majority of them are not figurative. For example, what I'm showing here, unfortunately, this is a heavily disturbed site outside of Quartzsite, Arizona, but I've highlighted the geoglyph here. This is one of my favorite ones. But you can see this is totally geometric. And is this art? Really, is it art if it doesn't really show representational forms, if it's not visible to anyone unless you're in the sky? Things to think about. Now, rock art, or rock imagery, as I have come to call it, is a global phenomenon. It occurs on every continent that humans have inhabited. So it is part of the human experience. It's innately human. There are theoretical reasons to explain that. Human evolutionary theories that have been presented. I'm showing some examples of Ellen Dissanyaki's work. She's written quite extensively about this. But essentially, there's something about the creation of rock imagery or symbolic forms on surfaces of the earth that was selected for in the evolutionary process. So it's a human thing, and it's integral to our survival and evolution as a species. Now, the way I've intersected with this topic is, 20 years ago to this year, it's anniversary year for me. I started this South Mountain rock art project in Phoenix. I was a PhD student at the time. I took this project as my dissertation subject, and before taking it was a fellowship offered by the Center for Desert Archaeology, which is now Archaeology Southwest, who I'm employed with. before taking the fellowship opportunity to do this work, I had no experience with rock art, rock imagery. I had documented a few examples in my short career as a CRM archaeologist before graduate school, and I was totally amazed by it. So when the opportunity came to do a dissertation project on it, I jumped at the chance. And that's a young version of me there. Uh, Now, when I was putting the slideshow together, the photograph at the right, I was trying to remember what folks were doing with that, but I believe we were measuring the height of that short or that small rock shelter. But of course, I published this work in the book Religion on the Rocks. And as you can see, this was published in 2014. At that time, I was still calling the subject matter rock art. It's in the title. And through that work over the past 20 years in my career, I've come to observe really interesting things. I'm an anthropologist, and I identify as an anthropologist even though I do archaeological work because really what I try to do is understand contemporary connections to material culture. So I study material culture, but my interest is how people today interact with it. And so when I was thrust into this world of what folks call rock art research, if you will, I noticed some really interesting things about the people that study it and appreciate it. I think this is a picture from Deer Valley Petroglyph Preserve in North Phoenix. As you can see, there's um, a person taking a photograph of the petroglyph, and you can see how the petroglyph panel is presented like on an art, like in an artwork, like you're in a museum, right? Um, and so I think in 2008, I attended my first American Rock Art Research Conference, um, American Rock Art Research Association conference in Farmington. And one of the great things about the conferences they have every year is that they have field trips. And I went on one of the field trips to a petroglyph site. And as soon as we got there, there's about 20 people in the group. Everyone pulled out their cameras, and there were these crazy cameras, these high-tech cameras with big lenses, and I'd never seen anything like it before. But there's this impulse for folks to take pictures of petroglyphs. It's everywhere, and further work. Some people take petroglyphs and pictographs, if you will, and put them on pedestals as if they are sculptures. They move them from their original context, and they put them in places. Um, these are examples from Taliesin West in Scottsdale. And then we get interesting things such as what I'm showing here. At right is a photograph of a petroglyph that's framed and put on someone's wall. And then at left, we have replicas of petroglyphs that are framed and put on someone's wall. So, at least in our culture, we have this, what I don't know really what the right word is for it, but it's a strange affinity for the rock imagery that we look at. And a lot of folks probably on the lecture tonight are interested in petroglyphs and pictographs, and so it's normal for us to take lots and lots of photographs. But I just find that to be a really interesting aspect of this line of research, and well, that was a sidetrack. So moving forward, in 2016, I edited this issue of Archaeology Southwest magazine. Of course, we were still using the term rock art at that time, but in there I put this little sidebar, "But is it art?" which is the title of my presentation tonight. And it's basically an acknowledgement that there's issues with this term. Not that the term is wrong per se, but it misses the fact that it's not just what we call rock art is not just something to look at. It has agency, if you will. The people who made it didn't necessarily view it as art. And so when we use the concept, we use the word, it sort of muddies the water in a sense, especially if we're approaching this anthropologically and we're trying to understand human behavior, human intention. In 2018, I did a small project at the Painted Rock Petroglyph site on the lower Gila River west of Gila Bend. We put together this brochure, and it was a site condition assessment. And in talking with the descendant communities, I asked them, what should we call these things, these petroglyphs? Do we call them rock art, something else? And this was the first time I'd actually queried a descendant community person about this subject. And there was no pause, there was no delay. It was a very simple response. No, we don't call it rock art, call it petroglyphs. That's what they are, right? They're images pecked into the rock. And so it was an eye-opening sort of dialogue that began. And then a few years later, a journalist, James Ponder, reached out to me to ask me some questions about some petroglyphs, and he ended up publishing this article. And in there, he interviewed Elizabeth Page, a member of the Torres Martinez Desert Cuya Nation in California. And I saw the quote when he asked her, what's the difference between petroglyphs and pictographs? And this was her answer. They are wrongly called art. The intent was to communicate vital information, not create art. And so the wheels got turning in my head. I was like, okay, so this is not a one-off. My conversations with the community in Arizona was not an anomaly, right? And so I wondered, what do Native American communities across the United States think about this concept of rock art? I've got a couple of examples in my personal experience that say it's kind of weird. And I've talked with other colleagues, and people have said, well, I know someone in such and such a tribe, and they don't have a problem with the term. And so it just seemed really open in terms of, descendant communities' perspectives. And so that prompted the question, and there's my presentation, and I'm going to present results of two surveys. The first one is the history of the archaeological debate around the concept of rock art or the term rock art. The other part I'll get to in a little bit is about, again, how do descendant communities feel about this term? And I got into this history of the debate in doing the research for the second survey. It was really in the 1990s when archaeologists began to critically evaluate this term or this concept. And I think the first one that really got any traction was some colleagues in Australia. And the argument was, what do we include in rock art? Is it everything that's on a rock, or does it have to be artistic, if you will? And so let's look at this comparison. Here we have what people call barrier canyon style rock art on the right from Utah. As you can see, figurative forms. I guess you could say there is some skill involved. When we think about artists, right? Yeah, maybe that's art. It's artistic, I guess. At left, we have geometric scratch tradition rock imagery or petroglyphs. This is an example from the lower Gila River. Would this be considered art? These are just some scratches, right? Where do we draw the line? Interestingly, this geometric scratch tradition does seem to be what we would think of as a style. It's bounded spatially, and so it's basically throughout the Patayan area, lower Colorado River and the surrounding deserts. The contexts are repetitive. They're pretty much always along trails, often near trail shrines. So it has style. Um, would it be called art? And in addition to this, I work with volunteers all the time, and I've had volunteers over the years ask me about these sorts of scratched images. And they ask, why do we need to document those? Are those even petroglyphs? Of course they're petroglyphs. So, where do we draw the line? But anyway, that sort of misses the point of the discussion tonight. Really, the significant argument that comes through is whether or not what we call rock art is more than art. And we had a seminal paper published in 1987 by Halverson, which basically he was arguing that Paleolithic cave paintings, right, like Lascaux and these really impressive things from 30, 40,000 years ago, were simply artworks, right? And had no significance to the societies that were making them other than it's some form of expression. That was challenged by Margaret Conkey in this book, Beyond Art. And she was arguing that, okay, these are symbols that are basically they function within society. And so calling them art or just simply regarding them as art was problematic from a research perspective. Around that same time, this book was published by Chippendale and Tasson. This was the first archaeology of rock art book, of course, that I read. I read it in earnest as I started my dissertation work. And they acknowledged in the introduction that the concept of rock art has a long history in the discipline. And so it has value in that, but it has problems. When we think about if we just limit this concept to art, then we're dealing with like notions of appropriation and problems, I guess, when we think about these traditional practices in a modern 20th, 21st century context. Are they really art? And so they propose the idea that you just simply hyphenate it to suggest that it is more than art, but it maintains that continuity with the discipline. That didn't really catch on very well. And most folks went back to just simply rock art unhyphenated. And so in the 2000s, this was about the time when I started in this field. So I missed those early years in my career, but right in the mid 2000s, there was pretty much a consensus, and it played out in this journal, Rock Art Research. There was some dialogue back and forth between researchers, and they pretty much concluded that the word rock art is just too entrenched in the discipline. And they've been using it for decades. You had organizations, for example, the Australian Rock Art Research Association, the American Rock Art Research Association, the International Federation of Rock Art Organizations, etc. You had our preeminent journals, Rock Art Research was in publication, as well as in the US, we have American Indian Rock Art, the annual publication of the American Rock Art Research Association. And so, basically, it's like we can't change the word now because then everyone would have to change their names. It was yada, yada, yada. And so, Robert Bednarik, who is a prominent figure, editor of Rock Art Research, he said that we don't need a new word, a neologism, right? We already have a rock art. It's what people are using. There's not a better term. On the US side, I found a real simplistic argument was that rock art just sounds better. And I actually would agree with this. I've gone through all the alternatives, and this one comes off the tongue pretty easily. It's 2 syllables, big concept, 2 syllables. So he has a point. That's William Breen Murray. And so confronting this subject, we wanted to do 2 different surveys. I really wanted to see what is the history of this concept of rock art in the literature, because Bednarik had said it's the word that we all use and been using it for decades, right? But of course, if you are familiar with the literature, that's not necessarily the case. There are plenty of alternatives. And so we brainstormed, my colleague John Welch and I, we brainstormed the different terms that we've seen or we've known people to use in reference to what we would call rock art. And this is the list. I believe there's 21 examples. If anyone has additional examples, please share them with me at the end of the lecture. But we thought this was pretty inclusive. I've highlighted these 5 because they are somewhat there's issues around them. Hieroglyph, of course, we wouldn't consider hieroglyphs to be rock art or petroglyphs in common parlance, but in the past, petroglyphs have been referred to as hieroglyphs. Petrograph, of course, that's a term that's most common in ceramic analyses, the petrography. Pictogram is a common term in medical research. Rock image is actually a very common term in geology. And then rock sculpture includes, of course, sculptures. And so in our survey, we made sure that we reviewed every article to make sure that we weren't including things that weren't related to our subject. And so our survey, we subjected it to journal articles or basically serial articles, a serial being a publication that's published on a semi-regular basis, either annually, sometimes it's not annually, but that would include journals, newsletters, bulletins. What we used for our survey were these 3 sources, these 3 databases, Scopus, Anthropology Online, and JSTOR. And there was actually quite a bit of overlap, as you can imagine. But each source had some examples that the others didn't have. So did we find everything? Probably not, but I would feel confident we found at least 95% of journal article titles published since the mid-19th century. So in all, we found 5,347 articles. First one being published in 1866. And these articles came from 797 different periodicals. That's not volume issues, that's different titles of publications. So different journals or different newsletters, etc. So it's worldwide. We did limit our survey to English only. So this is for, basically an English Anglophone, I guess, approach. And we also only surveyed the titles, not abstracts or the contents of volumes, often because the contents aren't available in the databases, but we also we eliminated proper nouns. So for example, a lot of places will have rock art in their title. A lot of organizations will have rock art in their title. And so that was not germane to our study. So anyway, we filtered a lot of the data. And this is what we ended up with. And so I'm going to present some of the results here. We looked at the data worldwide, Anglophone world, and then the US only. And this is a rank order for both sides. And of course, rock art is the most popular in either context. Petroglyph and pictograph are right below it. Interestingly, and probably expectedly if folks are familiar with the subject and read about it, outside of the US, pictograph is not used very regularly. Instead, the preference is rock painting. And also outside of the US, there's a stronger use of rock carving and rock engraving in reference to what we call petroglyphs here in the US. And you can dig deeper into this data. It became clear that there are regional jargons about how, in regard to how people talk about this subject matter. I think the most interesting for me was rock tracing. Um, rock tracing appeared in 6 articles, and within, I believe it was a 4-year time period. It was the like 1906 to 1910. And 5 of the 6 articles were in reference to some phenomena in Scandinavia. And so it just, I think, exemplified just the concept of jargon. But um, wanted to look at a time lapse of this. And it's a complex graph here. You'll see a lot of red at the right, of course. You notice also that all the bars don't reach all the way to 100%. So what I'm focusing on here right now are the 9 most popular terms. So not all the terms are shown here, just the 9 most popular. And so those where the bars don't reach all the way to the top, those are those other 12 terms that are not being illustrated. And so just at a gross scale, you can see that prior to the 1950s, there were a lot of different terms being used. That's why the bars don't go all the way to the top. You'll obviously notice that rock art's not present prior to the 1950s, really. In the US, at the right, the earliest terms are rock inscriptions. And in worldwide, rock engravings. And when we look at the data more closely, we draw 4 primary insights from this. The first use of rock art in academic article titles was in 1946, so relatively recently, and it was in reference to some imagery in what's today Zimbabwe. And then by the 1960s, the use of that term starts to increase dramatically. In the US, so that's going to be the right graph, in the mid 1970s, we see a spike in the term rock art. And then something similar, but maybe not so pronounced on the worldwide graph, you would see a spike starting in the 1980s and an additional spike in the 1980s for the term rock art. That's not necessarily mirrored in the US. And so when I thought about this pattern here and how to interpret it, how to explain it, we need to link this with developments in the anthropological field, if you will. What's up with the 1960s? Well, we had the publication of 2 of the foundational works on the subject. We have the Prehistoric Rock Art of Nevada and Eastern California by Heiser and Baumhoff in 1962. Still a great read. And then Rock Art of the American Indian, 1967 by Campbell Grant. And so this was basically the onset of the popularization of the term rock art. Now, interestingly, in the volume at left, Prehistoric Rock Art, Nevada and Eastern California, rock art does not occur in the volume at all. It's only in the title. And a gentleman, B.K. Swartz, he had written about this subject a little bit. He was led to believe that the word was added to the title by the press as a way to market the subject matter. And so it was basically a marketing ploy. And I don't know if that's true or not. That's what he's written to explain where this word came from in the title of this book. And so it makes sense that in Americanist research, that after the publication of these volumes, you would see an increase in the use of this term. And by 1975, it really takes off in the United States. And why would that be? Well, in 1974, we had the first meeting of what became to be known as the American Rock Art Research Association. at Wright. That's that first volume published in 1975 for the 1974 conference. And then in the 80s, something similar. We had the formation of the Australian Rock Art Research Association and the publication of Rock Art Research in 1984, which is still being published. So the two preeminent periodicals on the subject are published in these 2 decades. And so the spike in article title usage is correlated strongly with these phenomena. So how does this compare to all the other periodicals? Here's this line graph. American Indian Rock Art, that's the Aurora publication in red, Rock Art Research in blue, and everything else in the database, all the other 795 periodicals. And as you can see that there is, over time, generally an increase starting in the 1960s in using the term rock art. But both of the rock art specific publications are publishing titles at a higher, with the rock art in the title at a higher rate than all the other periodicals. And so the way I interpret this is that there has been some editorial bias in publications in preference of the term rock art over alternatives. And so these organizations are somewhat involved, or I don't know if complicit's the right word, but they're influential in the narrative, as we should expect. These are organizations dedicated to the subject. And so the takeaways from this first survey, really when we think about it, this word rock art is just one of several dozen terms that appear in the professional literature. And it's one of the youngest. Of the popular ones, it is the youngest. And so in reference to Mr. Bednarik's argument that we don't need a neologism or a new word to replace rock art, I would say rock art is the neologism. It replaced all the other terms. It was very clear that petroglyph, pictograph, rock painting, rock carving, rock engraving were entrenched in the literature for a century before rock art. And then, of course, the organizations that are dedicated to the subject matter, again, influence the dialogue. And that's probably a good thing. I guess you could say that means they're successful in their mission. So I want to turn to the second survey that we did, and this is, for me, the more interesting one. I had to do that historical backdrop to really contextualize this. And so at the time of our survey, this was in 2024 when we did the survey, there were 574 federally recognized tribes and Alaska Native entities in the United States. So our survey was limited to the United States. I believe that number is still 574 today. Now, you may ask, well, why didn't we include, tribes that are state recognized or not federally recognized, but self-identifying? We needed to be consistent in our methodology and our approach. And for tribes that are definitely ones that aren't recognized at the federal or state level, there's really not a point of contact that's easily accessible. So we wanted to reach out to every single one of these organizations and tribes, 574. And so that was a task, of course. We had to track down contact information for points of contact. We also only wanted one response per tribe. We didn't just want to send it out to everybody. We wanted one voice representing their community. And we wanted the person to be someone designated by their community to represent them. So we would think of tribal historic preservation officers, for example. They're they're designated to represent their community with regard to heritage matters. And so for unrecognized tribes, we don't really have points of contact. So this is the breakdown of the positions of everyone we reached out to. There are 223 tribal historic preservation officers in the United States. And so you've got 574 tribes, only 223 TIPOs. We had to reach out to people in addition to TIPOs. And the way we found these contacts is a variety of techniques. A lot of them were SHPO consultation guide, handbook or guides, as well as consultation guides for the federal agencies for in each state. So it was very comprehensive. We were able to find contact information for 374 representatives representing 422 tribes. Why is there that offset? Well, in Alaska, there was one individual representing about 50 different Native Alaskan corporations. So that's maybe 2/3, 3/4 of all of the federally recognized indigenous communities in the United States. We sent them a questionnaire. So this was an email questionnaire, cold call, if you will. We asked them 3 questions. Of course, we shared with them what we were doing. The questions were, is rock art an acceptable term, or is it inappropriate or otherwise problematic? What alternative term would you prefer that we use if it's not a good term for you? And then does the community that you work for have additional terms that they would like to share? Unsurprisingly, question 3 didn't get a lot of feedback. But questions 1 and 2, we got really good feedback. And so we had 35 tribes respond. Now, actually, since I put this publication together, we actually had a 36th one respond. They're not included in this study. But you can see here's the geographic distribution. Obviously, there's a strong representation from the West, maybe less so in the South and Midwest. But we have tribal representation from all 4 of these broad geographic regions. So I would say it's geographically representative. From 35 tribes, that is 6% of federally recognized, of the 574 federally recognized tribes, is 8% of the tribes that we invited, we were able to reach with the survey. And so that is, I would say that that's low. It's underwhelming response rate. However, comparable to other surveys that have done something similar to this, basically surveys of TIPOs, this is on par, if not exceeding the average response rate. So it showed that folks are definitely interested in the question. So I want to get into the results. And perhaps unsurprising to some of us, 2/3 of the respondents had a negative feeling or sentiment with regard to the term rock art. And it outweighs the positives 3-1, or is it maybe it's closer to 4-1. So there were positive responses, of course, and then a small sample of no opinion whatsoever. Now, interestingly, in the responses that folks provided, some of them, elaborated on the feeling behind their response. And so basically an explanation. And so this is in rank order what tribes responded with the problem they saw with the term: problematic, inaccurate, inappropriate, unacceptable, offensive, demeaning, and degrading. And so it's very strong towards one end of the spectrum, but it's not conclusive. Obviously there are groups that don't have an issue with it and actually prefer it. So we looked at the data in a geographic perspective and how did it break down in those four regions that we identified. Obviously in the Midwest, so at the right of the graph we have Midwest, and at the right we have West, at the left we have Midwest. Very strong negative responses. So this is going to be where we are here, and then the plains. And then in the South, we actually had a little bit higher response for the positive. And I can't really explain it. I think it's worth exploring more. But obviously, Indigenous communities across the US are not a monolithic entity. Every community has its own history, its own identity, its own opinions, etc. Went through, experienced different, things with the colonial, forces that they've been dealing with. So I think that's an interesting thing coming out of the survey here that is worth further research. Now, in terms of the terms that they preferred, this is a rank order. By and large, petroglyphs and pictographs is the preferred term for the alternatives. Rock writing is the second most popular or most appreciated term, followed by rock imagery, and then we get a lot of everything else has the sort of same value. But interestingly, in my opinion, quite a few of these terms did not appear in our brainstorm title search. Rock illustrations, depictions, symbols, designs, sacred history, culturally modified landmarks, folk messages. They were not on our brainstorm list. And I would be hard pressed to, we didn't follow up with the survey to see if these are in the literature, but I would be surprised if they are. Now, how does this compare with the article title survey? Well, there is commonality with the petroglyphs and pictographs, right? Of course, in the US articles, rock art is the most popular, but right now I'm just limiting it to what the Indigenous respondents preferred. But beyond that, everything is negligible. So rock writing is rock imagery, rock carving. Those are some of the least used terms in the academic literature. However, for Indigenous communities, those are some of the most preferred terms. So I think this illustrates the disjunction between the practice of rock art research and archaeology more broadly and involvement from Indigenous descendant communities. There's two dialogues going on here. And so, what are we to do with this? Is this something that we can't get past, or can we come to some sort of common ground? And I would encourage folks that are interested, you can, if you read the article I have for the communities that provided detailed commentary on the subject that's in there. I'm not going to read it for you here tonight. There's a lot to learn in there. And of course, these dialogues should continue. But I wanted to present one, I guess the takeaway comment that a person provided. And this is from Michael Kicking Bear Johnson. And I'm going to read it. Rock art is generic as the word indigenous. Where we feel it matters is when it is known who the created imagery comes from. Then we feel it is more appropriate to specifically use the name or the preference of the people where the imagery comes from. When it is not known as to which people the carved images come from, that is where too much speculation happens. Why specific designations of terms matter is because it supports and keeps intact past and present identity. Where the bigger challenges lie is when the creators of the images are not known. Then speculation arises. So trying to find an alternate word or term for rock art really isn't the problem. It's the publication of assumptions of authors who are merely trying to describe what they are looking at with literally no additional insight from indigenous sources to help shape narratives. Collaborative approaches are a much better way forward. It must involve descendant communities as much as possible. And so, Michael, I think, really nailed it. And it really comes down, it depends. There is not really a right and wrong term. It's, there's a lot of gray, it's fuzzy, and of course, the communities may not be in agreement unanimously with one term over another. Obviously, they have their own preferences. And what Mr. Kinky Mayor Johnson is really trying to emphasize is that it's incumbent upon us, scholars and researchers, to reach out to the communities. All the rock imagery in the US that we're looking at has descendant communities. We're not really dealing with Paleolithic stuff or so, even if it's archaic rock imagery, there are descendant communities. We have formal recognized procedures for identifying who those communities are in the areas where we work. It's incumbent upon us to reach out to these communities and to work with them and to, come up with, appropriate terms to use in reference to their heritage. And of course, rock imagery just being one aspect of that. And in doing the survey, and actually when I did the literature review for the historical debate, it kept coming up with we don't need a new term. We don't need a new term. So the Bednarik comment, we don't need a new logoism or neologism. And a lot, quite a few of the positive commentators in the Indigenous community survey said something similar. Is that, we don't need a new term. But really, is anyone asking for a new term? We've shown historically that there are at least 21 terms that have been used in the professional literature. And so when this dialogue, this debate surfaces every so often, I don't think anyone's asking for a new term per se. I think they're asking for an alternative to the term rock art in certain contexts. And there's 20 other, if we include the Indigenous contributions, we have nearly 30 different terms that we can use. So in the end, it depends, and I encourage folks to talk with the descendant communities that in the areas where they work, and also keep in mind, I learned that I really had to ask in a very humble way to get an honest response from individuals that I've talked with. So when we communicate with each other, whoever they are, often we don't want to offend anybody. And so sometimes I've experienced looking back on it that I'll get responses that are really responses that people think I want to hear and may not be how someone would honestly respond. And so that's part of this dynamic as well that needs to be considered. And so here, if you want to, get more into the weeds, here's a reference to the article, the DOI number at the bottom. You can get it. It's open access. You can read it. It is an academic article, so there's jargon, but it's going to elaborate on the methods, et cetera, and some more of the details. I also, before I put this article out, I had a blog post on quote why I don't call it art. You can read that. And in closing, I just want to thank everyone who's obviously tonight is listening, but then of course, the tribal representatives that participated in the survey. It was a really interesting process and to work with them. And then these individuals who helped with preparing the study. We've got some library assistants for the Scopus survey and then some National Park Service folks. But then, of course, Aurora, who recognized the value of this research with that Castleton Award last year. And that's my presentation. I'm opening it up for questions and comments and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Before we start sharing our audience questions and comments with our guest speaker, I'd like to ask Eldart to give you some information about Old Pueblo's mission and activities.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Old Pueblo Archaeology Center is a nonprofit organization set up to do education and research programs in archaeology, history, and cultures. You can see our mission here is basically about education and preservation and respect and, learning about traditional cultures. So some ways that we implement our mission, we offer educational tours. These are 3 that we have scheduled coming up through the fall. We will be scheduling more shortly, but the one on the left there, the date on it is obviously wrong. That should say March 20th, which is tomorrow. And that's a tour to the Picture Rock site, which you see a panel of here, and the Los Morteros Hohokam Village site. But that tour is filled now. In June, we'll be offering a tour in downtown Tucson to some of the historic Sonoran row houses down by the Tucson Museum of Art Historic Block. And that'll be led by historic architect Brooks Jeffrey. That one is still open. And then in October, we have a tour to the Yuma Wash Hohokam Village site and the Bajorcas Aguirre Ranch archaeological site, historic ranch. And those are actually both on the footprint of each other in Marana, Arizona. I don't expect we'll have any more between the June and October tours, but we'll have some more starting in the fall. And if you want more information on our tours or other programs, I'll put this in the chat shortly here. If you can email us at info@oldpueblo.org or just look at our website, oldpueblo.org. We do offer classes and workshops. Most of these are online. I have one coming up on the Mogollon culture of the U.S. Southwest starting in May. These will be on Wednesday evenings, 2 hours per session for 14 weeks. Another one in June, which is an overview of Hohokam pottery wares and types. That's a 5-session class, 1.5 hours per session starting in June. And a new class just newly scheduled is the Hohokam culture of Southern Arizona starting in September, again on Wednesday evenings from 6:30 to 8:30 for 14 weeks. We also occasionally offer craft workshops in flint knapping, arrowhead making by our expert flint knapper, Sam Greenleaf, shown here. We just finished one in December, so probably his next one will be in the fall sometime. He might do one late this spring, but we haven't worked out a schedule for that yet. As far as other online presence besides our classes, we publish a bulletin called Old Pueblo Archaeology, and you see our most recent issue on the left and the one coming out on the right. I hope to have that one out shortly online. If you subscribe to our email services, you will get a link to that automatically. One of the services we offer is to provide semi-monthly announcements about archaeology, history, and cultural related activities coming up throughout the Southwest offered by many organizations. And again, if you get onto our emailing list, which you can do by going to our website, I should say on the underline, it should say just oldpueblo.org for the website. But you can come down to this subscribe panel and put in your name and email address to get onto our emailing list for these announcements. This evening's program, Dr. Wright talked about, a very good program. I was looking forward to it. We have more Third Thursday Food for Thought programs coming up. Our next one in March will be by archaeologist Christopher Schwartz, who's the City of Phoenix archaeologist, and Ben Nelson, who is a professor emeritus at Arizona State University, talking about long distance exchange relationships between the U.S. Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. In April, our guest speaker will be Daniel Garcia. He's the archaeologist for Salt River Project in Phoenix, talking about ghost canals of the Phoenix area. And this doesn't mean actually haunted ghost canals. He'll be talking about tracing out historical canals, from what you can still see on the ground, particularly in aerial photographs. May 14th, we're going to have an encore presentation by archaeologist Ken Fetter about frauds and myths in archaeology. He gave us a presentation last year. It was kind of nationwide. This one, he's going to be focusing on the Southwest, some frauds and myths and mysteries in the Southwest. He's a very entertaining speaker. We post, whenever our speakers consent, we post these presentations online on our YouTube channel. So these are the most recent ones that we have online right now. We have probably about 25 or 30 different videos posted online now. So just Google Old Pueblo Archaeology YouTube and you'll find that. What we devote most of our attention and funding to is our children's education programs. We have a simulated archaeological dig site set up at our facility in Tucson, where we bring whole classrooms of kids in to teach them about archaeology and cultures and the scientific method. So we're always looking for money, for donations to support this program in particular. We don't have to spend a whole lot on these Zoom programs except for our annual Zoom subscription fees. But we do pay employees to work on our children's education program. So a lot of our expenses go towards that. So we're always looking for donations. We also have a membership support program that you can contribute yearly to. So we would very much appreciate if you're not already a member, if you could get in on that. So we're basically appealing for some support tonight, passing the hat, so to speak, and it's mainly to support our children's education programs. I will be providing some links in the chat here shortly, so you can find out where to go for all these programs. And it'll look something like that without the illustrations. So that's all I have to share here. Let's go on with the Q&A, Pat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Al. So we do have some questions. The first question that was asked a while ago was answered by Al in chat. The next one is by David Suckett. When you asked the individuals our images on the walls and boulder art, do you know if their notion of visual art was the same as yours or any of your reference? A Kaibeb Paiute elder at the, and I'm not sure what this is, at a conference, URABA conference this year, said the images weren't art because art is pretty. Of course, medieval Gothic and Renaissance visual art, not much different than our prehistoric art in Utah, with stories, significant figures, events, etc. I find the lack of familiarity of visual art and visual art history in the issue, not the terms.
Could you repeat the first part for me?
Yes, sorry. When you asked the individuals, are images on the walls and boulders art? Do you know if their notion of visual art was the same as yours or any of your references? A Kaibab Paiute elder at the URARA conference this year said the images weren't art because art is pretty. Of course, medieval Gothic and Renaissance visual art, not much different than our prehistoric art in Utah, with stories, significant figures, events, etc. I find that the lack of familiarity of visual art and visual art history is the issue, not the terms.
Okay, a little bit of a difficult question. So in the survey, we didn't necessarily ask anyone if we thought something was art. we just asked them about the term rock art and if it was a problem or not. But so I can't answer that specifically in terms of comparing, I guess the implication is my understanding of art with the tribal representatives. But the question gets at what I didn't cover in the lecture tonight, what I talk about in the paper is, what do we call art? And it gets down to the concept of aesthetics, right? And there are different understandings of what art is, and it's a theoretical discussion, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on it. Some people maintain that art has to have some sort of aesthetic quality. Aesthetics being it invokes some sort of emotion, pleasure, actually even disgust in ways, but it evokes something in us emotionally. Whereas postmodern concepts of art do away with that. So if you think about Dadaism and things like that, that just really deconstructed what art is. So it really comes, what is your definition of art? Clearly, what the person in their question was referencing from the Paiute individual was that it's implied in their response that their understanding of art requires aesthetics. It has to be beautiful or whatnot. So, and I would say most common average people, I think, would ascribe to that definition of art. Even that's in my presentation. It goes, but when you think about the history of the debate, the Rosenfeld versus Bednarik, do we include all markings as rock art, or do we only include the ones that are iconic or look interesting or intelligible to us? So it's a theoretical argument, and we can talk in circles about it. But if you read the paper, a lot of the responses from the tribal representatives go into detail on why it's not art to them. And it's basically because it's not, whether it looks good or not, it wasn't made for that sole reason. It was made for some specific reason for their communities, and those reasons vary. Their historical records, their prayers, various other sundry explanations. So I hope I addressed the question effectively.
Thank you. Another question. Some of the tribes from David Sewell, some of the tribes that responded have reservations in traditional lands that contain a good deal more rock imagery than other tribes. Did that affect the responses in any consistent way?
It did. I don't know. I can't think right now how it may have affected the results of the survey, but a number of the respondents did say, "Hey, we don't have this in our reservation." Obviously there are places where rock imagery doesn't exist. Think about the Great Plains, right? There's not a lot of rock outcrops in certain places. So some folks did respond to that they don't have it where they are. And others, some also mentioned that they had never thought about it, whether or not it exists or not. They had not thought about it. And they had to consult with other people in the community because they were unfamiliar. And so that's, I guess, to answer the question, that's basically the limit that I can provide on that. I don't think it affected the survey in the results in any regard.
Thank you. Todd Bradley. When analyzing the responses to the second survey, did you consider weighing the responses by size of the represented group? Question. If you were able to do that, did it give you any different insights?
So we didn't do that. That's really interesting to think about. If we should weight, say, let's think by size. We can talk about land mass, or we can talk about population. But okay, let's look at Cherokee Nation, right? Huge, or the Navajo Nation, or Tohono. I mean, these are huge reservations with relatively large populations. Um, I did not, and I didn't think it was necessarily fair to do that. So we wanted to give each federally recognized tribe one vote, essentially, independent of where they were, what their population was. We did get more than one result from some communities. And it was only a few. In each case, they were unanimous, so we only counted them once, but we didn't have any internal community conflicts. Of course, I just know from my personal experience that within communities there's disagreement. And so what this presented was the, perspective of the delegate from the community, the ordained representative, heritage representative. So it would be great to do a much larger survey, right, where we're talking about thousands of members of these communities, but not in this survey.
Elizabeth Butler. Hi, Aaron. What names do the descendant communities that you work with prefer for what has been called rock art?
It depends on which community. So I work in Southern Arizona, Western Arizona. It's relatively limited from a jargon perspective, petroglyphs, some pictographs. The folks that I work with professionally, I've never had someone say they prefer the term rock art. Although, that kind of came out in the survey that seems to be in the South. That's, more accepted than elsewhere. But yeah, so it varies from community to community. Petroglyph and pictograph seem to be the most preferred. And it's because the reason it's been explained to me, it's because they're neutral terms. They talk about the technology. They're not loaded. When we use the word art, it has a lot of connotations to it, right? Petroglyph and pictograph are simply those words reference the manufacturing technique. The petro is carved and the picto is painted. But with some of the upland human communities that I work with, so Yavapai, for example, and I believe the Southern Paiute have this similar perspective that they prefer the term rock writing. And it's because they understand the petroglyphs to be written records. And so some of their tribal members, their elders can read. And so of all the words that I had in the survey, the 21, petroglyph, pictograph, and rock writing seem to be the most preferred in this area of the country, amongst the people I work with.
Christopher Rhodes has a link. Here's that he says, here's a different perspective from the other side from a respected authority, and there's a link. And I don't know how you want to do that, Al. Did you want to put that in the chat?
Well, it is a link. He's referring to a specific article here. Let me find it here in the chat. Hang on.
I see the link, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know which one he's talking about there, Aaron?
I'm pulling it up right now. Let's see. Sorry. Oh, Morales. Okay, let's see. For some reason, let me see the date. For some reason, my browser's not letting me open that. 2005. So I believe I considered this article in the literature review. At least Morales had a pretty important article in 2002. This is 2005. I suspect it's the same argument, but so I could be wrong, but Morales' argument was that for individuals who have a problem with the term rock art is that they don't understand what art is, right? And so I can't speak specifically to this link right here because I can't open it, but Morales
Okay,
is,
I was able to pull it up.
yeah.
It's a chapter in a book, but I don't have the title of the book. It's chapter 5, Considerations on the Art and Aesthetics of Rock Art by Ronaldo Morales Jr.
And so that gets back, okay, so the premise gets back to basically how do we define art? And again, is it require aesthetics or not? He probably didn't change his opinion from 2002. The critique of this presentation is that art, what we call art, is subjective, and it's basically culturally determined. Aesthetics is a human universal. There are things that move us emotionally. Is everything that's aesthetic art? Is all art aesthetic? And that's where we get into the theoretical debate and the theoretical disagreement. And I think the takeaway from my lecture and my argument would be that regardless of whether or not we think it's art, do we need to call it that when we're talking about the heritage of other people, right? Does my preference and my interest outweigh, the patrimony of descendant communities over their heritage? So that's really, I believe, the discussion that needs to be had. My opinion is kind of pointless.
Okay, thank you. From Lee Chandler, do you have any information on what prehistoric people may have viewed as art? If rock imagery was not necessarily viewed as art to them, I am curious if there is anything in the archaeological record to indicate what they did view as art. For example, was it in pottery, motifs, textiles, wall paintings?
Well, I can't ask any of those individuals what they thought was art. Did they have a concept of art? I don't know. Descendant communities usually the concept is largely Eurocentric. It's not to say that the indigenous communities don't create things for aesthetic purposes, etc. But the term art is a loaded term, which is the fun. Yeah, it's really the basis of this sort of dilemma, I guess. It's clear that people use, so talking about Southern Arizona, people use iconography and illustrations to artify, to borrow Desenyaki's term, to artify their environment. So they put images on pots, they put them on rocks, they probably painted buildings. We do have some painted architecture remnants in the Hohokam area. So it's obvious that they adhered to what we would call styles. So there was I guess, a shared cultural template on how certain things should be illustrated, what should be illustrated, what should not be illustrated. So I guess there are rules, socially agreed upon customs and rules around illustrations, iconography, etc. And so I guess there's a valid argument to say that that's art. I don't disagree with any sort of conclusion that folks created the art. But would they consider it art, or is it just art? And unfortunately, they're not around anymore to ask, but their descendants are. And that's why we did the Indigenous Perspective Survey. And overwhelmingly, they agree that art is not, it's a misidentification, even if it looks good. It wasn't made just to look good. These are images that have knowledge and power under them, that they need to be approached in certain ways and considered certain ways. So, sorry, Lee.
Well, that was the end of the Q&A. Now, there are some comments, of course, in the chat. And Al, I'm having kind of a difficult time seeing some of the chat.
Okay, I can.
Could you do it for me?
Yeah, thanks. Let me scroll back up here. There's a couple of long messages from me I have to get through.
Yeah, I'm getting a little confused on that.
Yeah, Pat mentioned I put the title of the Wright and Welch article in one of my chat comments, and Aaron mentioned the DOI reference to that, so I just put that in farther down if you want to look that up. Todd Bradley commented, it's unfortunate there were no responses to the second survey from the largest two tribes, Navajo and Cherokee, assuming he read that slide correctly. So you didn't get a response from those?
No.
Okay.
No.
Did you get one from Tohono?
Yes.
Okay, figured you would. Okay, we have Chris Rhodes's link there. Lee's comment.
Now to that last comment, if I can add, so when we published the paper, you know, obviously it goes through a peer review, and one of the reviewers, one of their comments, I don't know if it was a criticism, was that the tribes that me and my co-author John Welch work with closely, they noticed that some of those tribes didn't respond to the survey. And I emphasized in my response to the reviewer, and I'll reiterate it here, that we try to be as objective in this as we can. So even though we work with certain tribes and we have stronger relationships with some over than others, we didn't want to skew the results in any regard. So that is why some tribes you would think are present or not present that you'd think they would be. So it was a product of our methodology. Sorry, please continue.
Okay. Emily B just has a comment. Writing and art were inseparable, at least here in Yucatan.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, that link that Christopher put in, he notes here in the chat that the security certificate expired last year, so some of you might not be able to access that. So Christopher, if you might want to contact the website owner and let them know that it needs to be updated. And then I had the DOI reference that Aaron referenced there. Some thank you notes here. And let's see if there's anything else past my other long one here. Okay, one from Tim Askelson. He says, good evening, Aaron. Have any of the younger members from Indigenous communities that you've worked with along the Gila River had a definite knowledge of the meaning of certain rock imagery that you've observed?
Definite meaning. Wow, that's definitely some of the individuals that I've worked with, the Indigenous community members that have worked on my projects with me, they know what the rock imagery is. So is it a definite meaning? I don't really know. But they know what it means to them and to their people, and I'm not in any place to disagree with them. And that's why I just really love this kind of work. And it goes back to that, you know, I approach this as an anthropologist, and when the significance of these old things to the contemporary people, and especially the descendant communities, is the most, you know, worthwhile and interesting aspect of all of this. So in short, 10, yes.
Okay, that's all I see in the chat, and there's no new ones in the Q&A. So, Aaron, do you have any wrap-up comments here based on discussions?
No, I welcome folks' comments and feedback. Obviously, there's not a right, word. I'm not advocating for one way or the other. I've obviously chosen a certain direction in my life. And so, but I did ask if anyone has additional terms that maybe I overlooked. I'd love to hear, what they are. And if anyone learns more or has epiphanies of any kind, feel free to share them with me. You can find my email address online, and I welcome all comments, positive and negative.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
can find Aaron's contact information through the Archaeology Southwest website here in Tucson. Okay, Pat.
Well, thank you. On behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Wright, for sharing with us this evening. And we also thank all of you in our audience for joining us. Please consider making a donation to support Old Pueblo's efforts to educate children and adults about archaeology, history, and cultures, including through programs like this one. Thank you all, and good night.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Pat. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Aaron. It was great.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good night.